Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now, let's step inside.
Inside America's most isolated prison, there is a place in the United States where silence is not just common, it is enforced. A place where the walls do not echo voices, because voices are rarely heard. Where the doors do not slam, because they do not open often enough to make noise. Where the passage of time is not marked by movement, but by stillness. This place is not hidden overseas. It is not a relic of the past. It exists right now, operating every day, deep in the mountains of Colorado. And once someone is sent there, the system is designed so they may never truly leave it behind. This is America's federal Supermax prison. Often described as the most secure prison in the world, it was built to hold individuals considered too dangerous, too influential, or too disruptive to be housed anywhere else. The facility is designed not just to confine bodies, but to control behavior, communication, and even thought itself. From the outside, it does not look extraordinary. No towering walls, no dramatic gates, no sense of scale that matches its reputation. But beneath the surface, quite literally, lies a system built on absolute control. Here, isolation is not a temporary measure. It is the foundation. In this prison, a person can spend 23 hours a day alone inside a concrete cell. Sometimes longer. Days blur into weeks. Weeks dissolve into months. And for some, months stretch into decades. There are no crowds, no open yards, no casual conversations, no human touch. Even the sky is rationed. Windows are narrow and placed high above eye level, offering only a thin strip of light. Enough to confirm the world still exists, but not enough to feel part of it. Every movement is calculated. Every interaction is monitored. Every routine is designed to prevent unpredictability. The goal is simple: nothing should ever go wrong. And in pursuit of that goal, the prison removes nearly everything that makes life feel human. What happens to the mind when silence becomes permanent? What happens when identity is reduced to a number? What happens when survival depends not on strength, but on routine, discipline, and mental endurance? These are not theoretical questions. They are questions answered daily inside Supermax prisons. For decades, this facility has housed individuals whose names once dominated headlines. Figures associated with terrorism, organized crime, mass violence, and national security threats. But alongside them are others who do not fit the public's idea of the worst of the worst. People who were sent here not for what they did, but for what the system believes they might do. Leadership, influence, reputation, power that exists even behind bars. In this prison, power itself is treated as a threat. And once someone is labeled a threat, the system closes around them. The architecture reflects this philosophy. Cells made entirely of concrete, beds molded into the floor, furniture designed to be immovable, doors operated electronically from a distance. No keys, no negotiation, no margin for error. Even the guards do not move casually. 2 officers at all times. Hands always controlled. Procedures layered on top of procedures. This prison was designed with one core assumption. If something can go wrong, it eventually will. So nothing is left to chance. But while the system focuses on preventing escape, violence, and communication, there is another question it rarely answers. What does this environment do to the people inside it? Isolation, when applied briefly, can be a disciplinary tool. Applied for years, it becomes something else entirely. Psychologists have long debated the effects of prolonged solitary confinement. Studies suggest it can distort perception, disrupt sleep, increase anxiety, and erode a person's sense of reality. Inside a Supermax, these effects are not side effects. They are predictable outcomes. Time loses structure. Space loses meaning. Silence becomes heavy. Some people adapt by building strict routines. Others retreat inward. Some cling to the idea of release, a date on the calendar that proves this is not forever. And some have no release date at all. For them, the future does not exist in years, only in days survived. Yet from the outside, the prison is often portrayed as necessary, a final solution, a place to put people society does not know how to manage. Supporters argue that it keeps everyone else safe, inmates, guards, and the public alike. Critics argue that it creates long-term psychological damage that follows people long after release. Both sides claim security. Both sides claim necessity. But very few people ever hear what daily life inside actually feels like. What it's like to wake up to silence. To eat every meal alone. To measure progress not by achievements, but by endurance. To live in a place where nothing happens by design. This is not a story about escape plans or dramatic riots. It is not about glorifying crime or condemning punishment. It is about understanding a system built on total control and the human cost that comes with it. Because when a prison removes nearly all human interaction, it forces a single question to the surface. At what point does punishment stop being about safety and start becoming something else entirely? This is how Supermax prisons actually work. What a Supermax prison really is. When people hear the word Supermax, they often imagine a prison that is simply more secure than the rest. Thicker walls, more guards, stronger doors. But that assumption misses the point. A Supermax prison is not just a higher security version of a normal facility. It is a fundamentally different system built on a different philosophy of control. In the United States, the most well-known example is ADX Florence, officially called the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. It is the only federal prison designed from the ground up to operate as a true Supermax. Everything about it, from its architecture to its daily routines, is shaped by one overriding principle: total isolation as a management tool. To understand how a Supermax works, you have to first understand why it exists. The idea behind the Supermax. Supermax prisons were created as a response to what authorities viewed as an unsolvable problem: inmates who continued to exert influence, organize violence, or disrupt operations even while incarcerated. In traditional prisons, power doesn't disappear when a cell door closes. It adapts. Gangs reorganize. Hierarchies form. Messages move quietly from person to person. The Supermax model attempts to eliminate that possibility entirely. Instead of managing behavior through movement, incentives, or group separation, Supermax prisons aim to remove interaction itself. If people cannot communicate, they cannot organize. If routines are rigid and monitored, unpredictability disappears. If influence requires contact, then isolation becomes the ultimate countermeasure. This is why Supermax prisons are often described not as correctional institutions, but as containment facilities. Architecture as control. The design of a Supermax prison is not accidental. It is psychological as much as physical. Cells are typically constructed almost entirely from poured concrete: floors, walls, ceilings, and even beds. Furniture is fixed in place. Fixtures are minimal. There is nothing loose, nothing flexible, nothing that can be repurposed. The environment itself limits behavior. Each cell is designed for single occupancy, not as a temporary measure, but as the default condition. Unlike general population housing, there are no shared spaces where inmates naturally gather. Even recreation areas are isolated, often resembling enclosed yards or cages rather than open fields. Doors are operated electronically from remote control stations. There are no keys in the traditional sense. This creates physical distance between staff and inmates, reinforcing the idea that control does not require proximity. Even windows serve a specific function. They are narrow, positioned high, and offer only partial views of the outside world. Enough light to establish day and night, but not enough to provide orientation, scenery, or a sense of place. In a Supermax, the building itself does much of the work. A day defined by stillness. Life inside a Supermax follows a schedule, but it is a schedule defined more by absence than activity. Most inmates spend at least 22 to 23 hours a day inside their cells, every day. Meals are delivered through slots in the door. Education, if available, is typically broadcast through closed-circuit television. Communication with staff is brief, procedural, and limited. Recreation, when permitted, usually occurs alone. Sometimes indoors. Sometimes outdoors in small, enclosed areas. There is no casual exercise, no pickup games, no shared equipment. The goal is movement without interaction. This is not accidental. Supermax prisons are designed to minimize decision-making. Fewer choices mean fewer opportunities for conflict, resistance, or improvisation. The routine becomes predictable, repetitive, and tightly controlled. Over time, the routine replaces the outside world. Who gets sent to a Supermax? Contrary to popular belief, Supermax prisons are not reserved exclusively for people convicted of the most violent crimes. While many inmates have committed serious offenses, placement in a supermax is often based on perceived risk, not just past actions. Common reasons include leadership roles within gangs or criminal organizations, high-profile cases involving national security or organized crime, repeated violence or disruption inside other prisons, inability to be safely housed elsewhere. In some cases, the deciding factor is not what someone has done, but what officials believe they could do if given access to others. This distinction matters. A supermax is not just a response to behavior. It is a preventive measure. Once that designation is made, it can be extremely difficult to reverse. Isolation as policy, not punishment. In many prisons, isolation is used temporarily for discipline, safety, or investigation. In a supermax, isolation is not a punishment layered on top of incarceration. It is the baseline condition. This is one of the most controversial aspects of the system. Supporters argue that this level of control is necessary to protect staff, other inmates, and the public. They point to reduced violence, fewer incidents, and the inability of inmates to coordinate criminal activity. Critics argue that prolonged isolation can cause lasting psychological harm, especially when used for years at a time. Studies have linked extended solitary confinement to anxiety, depression, cognitive impairment, and difficulty reintegrating into social environments. The debate continues, but the structure of the supermax remains largely unchanged. Security without visibility. One of the most striking features of a supermax prison is how quiet it is. There are no crowded hallways, no open dorms, no constant noise of hundreds of people living together. Sound is absorbed by concrete. Voices rarely travel far. Silence becomes normal. From an operational standpoint, this quiet is a sign of success. Fewer disturbances mean fewer emergencies. Fewer emergencies mean fewer chances for things to go wrong. But silence also changes perception. Without external reference points, conversations, movement, variety, time can lose its shape. Days begin to feel interchangeable. Progress becomes difficult to measure. In a system built on prevention, the absence of incidents is considered proof that the system works. What it does to the people inside is a different question. A prison designed to last. Supermax prisons are built with longevity in mind. Materials are chosen for durability. Systems are designed to operate continuously. There is little emphasis on rehabilitation programs that require group participation or interpersonal development. Instead, the focus is stability. Once someone enters a supermax, movement out is typically slow and conditional. Some facilities offer step-down programs that gradually reintroduce limited interaction, but progress depends on long-term compliance and institutional assessment. For those without a clear release date, the supermax becomes less a phase and more a permanent environment. More than a building. At its core, a supermax prison is not just a place, it is a philosophy. A belief that absolute control produces absolute safety. That the removal of human contact can neutralize risk. That containment is preferable to engagement when stakes are high. Whether that philosophy succeeds depends on what one measures. If the metric is escape attempts, coordinated violence, or organized disruption, the system performs as intended. If the metric is mental health, reintegration, or long-term human cost, the answer is far more complicated. Understanding how a supermax works requires holding both realities at the same time. And to truly grasp its impact, we have to look beyond the walls and into the lived experience of isolation itself, what it feels like, how people adapt to it, and what it leaves behind. Living in extreme isolation. Extreme isolation is not something that announces itself with violence or noise. Inside a supermax prison, it arrives quietly, settles in slowly, and then becomes the dominant force shaping every hour of the day. There is no single moment when a person realizes they are isolated. Instead, it reveals itself through routine, through repetition so consistent that it begins to erase contrast. In a supermax environment, the cell is not just where someone sleeps. It is where nearly all of life happens. The cell becomes a bedroom, a dining room, a classroom, a gym, a library, and for long stretches of time, the only world a person knows. There is no casual movement through hallways, no gathering before meals, no shared downtime. Every activity that would normally mark the passing of a day is compressed into a single, confined space. And over time, that compression reshapes perception. A day without landmarks. In most environments, days are defined by transitions. Leaving one place for another. Seeing different people. Moving from task to task. In isolation, those landmarks disappear. A typical day begins early, often before sunrise. Breakfast arrives through a slot in the door. There is no cafeteria, no line, no chatter. The tray is collected later the same way it arrived, silently. After that, the day opens up into something that feels vast, despite the lack of physical space. There may be scheduled recreation, but even that is tightly controlled and brief. An hour alone in an enclosed area, sometimes indoors, sometimes outdoors, depending on the unit and the conditions. The rest of the time is unstructured. This unstructured time is not freedom. It is something closer to suspension. Without external cues, the brain struggles to organize the hours. Minutes stretch. Hours fold into one another. Days begin to feel interchangeable, distinguished only by what appears on a television screen or the contents of a meal tray. In isolation, routine becomes survival. The cell as a mental landscape. The physical dimensions of a Supermax cell are intentionally modest. Concrete surfaces dominate. Furniture is fixed in place. There are no soft edges, no textures that change with time. Even sound behaves differently, absorbed rather than echoed. At first, the mind reacts to this environment with resistance. Thoughts race. Attention jumps from one sensation to another. Small irritations feel magnified, but the mind adapts. People begin to build internal structures to replace the missing external ones. Some divide the day into strict schedules. Exercise at a certain hour, reading at another, television later. Others focus on repetitive physical activity, pacing, push-ups, laps measured by footsteps rather than distance. These routines are not about productivity. They are about anchoring identity. Without them, the days risk dissolving into an indistinct blur. Silence as a constant presence. Silence in a Supermax is not absolute. There are distant sounds, doors opening somewhere down the range, muffled voices carried through vents, the occasional announcement. But these sounds are unpredictable and fleeting. What dominates is the absence of sustained human noise. This silence has weight. It presses in rather than receding. In the absence of conversation, the mind fills the space with memory, imagination, and anticipation. Past events replay. Future scenarios repeat. Small worries expand. For some, the silence becomes calming after long exposure. For others, it amplifies anxiety. There is no single reaction, but nearly everyone experiences a shift in how they relate to their own thoughts. In isolation, you are never distracted from yourself. Controlled movement. Movement inside a Supermax is rare and deliberate. When it happens, it is supervised, planned, and procedural. 2 officers. Clear commands. Precise timing. This level of control reinforces a simple message. Movement is a privilege, not a right. Even when leaving the cell for medical appointments or recreation, the process is designed to minimize unpredictability. Hands are controlled. Routes are fixed. Doors open and close in sequence. The experience is not chaotic. It is mechanical. Over time, this controlled movement trains the body to remain still. Energy is conserved. Gestures become smaller. Posture stiffens. The body adapts to confinement just as the mind does. Interaction without contact. Human interaction in a Supermax is indirect. Conversations, when they happen, occur through solid doors, vents, or brief exchanges with staff. There is no eye contact with peers. No shared meals. No casual laughter carried across a room. When people do communicate, it is often brief and carefully measured. Not because of constant threat, but because prolonged interaction is rare enough to feel significant. For individuals who are not affiliated with groups or gangs, this lack of interaction can be both a relief and a challenge. Conflict is minimized, but so is connection. Respect becomes the default currency. Conversations are kept neutral. Boundaries are rigid. In a place where everything is monitored, neutrality feels safe. The role of the institution. From the institution's perspective, isolation simplifies management. Fewer interactions mean fewer opportunities for violence, contraband exchange, or coordinated disruption. Staff can focus on procedure rather than negotiation. Supermax prisons are typically overseen by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which emphasizes consistency, documentation, and risk reduction. Every deviation from routine is logged. Every request is evaluated through layers of approval. This structure is not personal. It is systematic. And because it is systematic, it can feel impersonal even when individuals within it act professionally. Psychological adaptation. One of the most misunderstood aspects of isolation is how gradually it changes a person. There is rarely a dramatic breaking point. Instead, changes accumulate quietly. Sleep patterns shift. Appetite fluctuates. Attention narrows. Emotions become muted or, at times, disproportionately intense. Many people report a loss of spatial awareness. Without visual landmarks or varied environments, it becomes difficult to orient oneself in time and space. Days feel shorter or longer without clear reason. Memories blur at the edges. To counter this, some people cling to external markers, television schedules, meal rotations, or personal goals tied to release dates. These markers provide proof that time is still moving forward. Without them, time can feel circular. The importance of purpose. Perhaps the most critical factor in surviving extreme isolation is purpose. Purpose does not have to be grand. It can be as simple as maintaining physical health, reading a certain number of books, or writing letters regularly. What matters is that it provides direction. In an environment where nothing is demanded beyond compliance, self-imposed goals become essential. People who maintain a sense of purpose tend to describe isolation as something they endure. Those who lose it describe feeling consumed by it. The difference is subtle but profound. Isolation is not the same for everyone. It is important to recognize that isolation affects individuals differently. Factors such as mental health history, length of confinement, and certainty about the future all play a role. Someone with a clear release date may experience isolation as a countdown. Someone without one may experience it as an indefinite state. The environment is the same. The experience is not. This variability is part of what makes Supermax prisons so difficult to evaluate. Outcomes are inconsistent. Some people adapt. Others struggle deeply. Many carry the effects with them long after they leave. A system that does not change easily. Supermax prisons are designed for stability, not flexibility. Policies change slowly. Conditions are standardized. Individual needs are secondary to institutional consistency. From an administrative standpoint, this reduces risk. From a human standpoint, it can feel unyielding. Isolation, once established as the baseline, becomes self-perpetuating. The longer someone lives within it, the harder it becomes to transition out. And that transition, back to interaction, unpredictability, and social complexity, is often the most difficult part of the experience. Extreme isolation is not defined by dramatic events. It is defined by absence of contact, variety, spontaneity. Over time, that absence becomes a presence of its own, shaping thought, behavior, and identity. To understand Supermax prisons, it is not enough to examine their walls or security systems. You have to understand what it means to live day after day in a place where nothing happens by design. And to fully grasp the consequences of that design, we must look next at the systems that enforce it, the layers of security, surveillance, and control that make isolation possible. Security, surveillance, and total control. To understand how a Supermax prison functions, you have to understand its core operating principle: control without constant confrontation. Unlike traditional prisons, where order is often maintained through visibility and presence, a Supermax relies on systems, layers of procedure, architecture, and surveillance that reduce the need for direct force. The goal is not intimidation. It is predictability. At the center of this approach is ADX Florence, a facility engineered to make spontaneity nearly impossible. Every design choice, every rule, and every movement path exists to ensure that no single moment can spiral beyond control. Security as a system, not a reaction. In most environments, security responds to events. In a Supermax, security exists to prevent events from ever forming. The prison operates on the assumption that risk increases wherever unpredictability exists. So unpredictability is systematically removed. Movement is scheduled. Interaction is limited. Objects are fixed in place. Even personal routines are indirectly shaped by institutional structure. Rather than reacting to conflict, the system is designed so that conflict has nowhere to develop. This philosophy explains why Supermax prisons appear quiet and uneventful. Calm is not incidental. It is the product of constant, invisible enforcement. Layers of control. Security in a Supermax is not a single barrier. It is a sequence of overlapping layers, each one reinforcing the next. The outer perimeter is the most visible: fencing, razor wire, controlled access points, and surveillance coverage. These measures serve as deterrence and detection, ensuring that unauthorized movement in or out of the facility is virtually impossible. Inside the perimeter, control becomes more granular. Housing units are divided into sections, ranges, and cells, each separated by electronically operated doors. No single officer controls an entire movement. Instead, actions are confirmed across multiple checkpoints. One door opens only after another is verified as closed. This layered design ensures that no individual mistake becomes a system failure. Electronic doors and remote operation. One of the defining features of a Supermax is the absence of traditional keys. Doors are operated electronically from control stations, often referred to as bubbles, secure rooms with visibility over specific areas. From these stations, staff can open or close individual cell doors, monitor movement corridors, confirm schedules and authorizations, lock down entire sections instantly. This remote operation serves two purposes. First, it reduces physical proximity between staff and inmates, lowering the chance of confrontation. Second, it centralizes authority, making every movement traceable and accountable. In this environment, access is not negotiated. It is authorized, or it is denied. Surveillance without blind spots. Surveillance in a Supermax is comprehensive, but it is not always obvious. Cameras are positioned to monitor corridors, recreation areas, and movement paths. Audio systems capture activity where permitted. Records are kept meticulously. This level of observation is not meant to feel dramatic. It is meant to be routine. Over time, surveillance becomes background noise, always present, rarely acknowledged. Its effectiveness lies in its consistency. When people know that actions are observed and documented, behavior changes naturally. From the institution's perspective, this reduces the need for constant intervention. From the individual's perspective, it reinforces the understanding that privacy is limited and conditional. Controlled movement protocols. Movement is one of the most tightly regulated aspects of life in a Supermax. Unlike lower security facilities, where inmates may move in groups or independently within designated areas, Supermax movement is escorted and sequential. When an individual leaves their cell for medical appointments, recreation, or administrative reasons, the process follows a strict protocol. Authorization is confirmed. Routes are cleared. Other doors are secured. Staff escort is maintained throughout. This ensures that individuals never encounter one another unexpectedly. Paths do not cross. Timelines do not overlap. The result is an environment where movement occurs, but interaction does not. The role of procedure. If architecture is the skeleton of a Supermax, procedure is its nervous system. Every action, no matter how small, is governed by policy. Requests for basic needs follow defined channels. Deviations are documented. Patterns are analyzed. These procedures are overseen by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which prioritizes consistency across facilities. In a Supermax, consistency is not just administrative, it is protective. From the institution's standpoint, standardized procedure minimizes liability and ensures accountability. From the individual's standpoint, it creates a world where outcomes are predictable but inflexible. There is comfort in knowing what will happen. There is frustration in knowing it cannot change. Intelligence and risk assessment. Security in a Supermax extends beyond physical measures. Information plays a critical role. Communications, mail, phone calls, visits are monitored and evaluated, not to intrude unnecessarily, but to identify patterns, affiliations, or emerging risks. This intelligence gathering is continuous and cumulative. The goal is not immediate enforcement. It is long-term risk management. By understanding who communicates with whom, how often, and about what, administrators aim to prevent coordination before it occurs. In this way, surveillance becomes predictive rather than reactive. Staff roles and boundaries. Staff in a Supermax operate within clearly defined roles. Interaction is professional, procedural, and brief. Personal familiarity is discouraged. Emotional distance is maintained. This is not necessarily about distrust. It is about maintaining boundaries in an environment where power imbalance is extreme. By limiting informal interaction, the institution reduces the potential for manipulation, favoritism, or conflict. The relationship between staff and inmates is not adversarial. It is transactional. Tasks are completed. Procedures are followed. Distance is preserved. Control without chaos. One of the paradoxes of a Supermax prison is how calm it appears given its reputation. There are no constant alarms, no frequent lockdowns triggered by disturbances, no visible tension in daily operations. This calm is intentional. By removing opportunities for escalation, the system minimizes the need for force. Physical restraint, chemical agents, and emergency response teams exist, but they are backups, not defaults. In a Supermax, the highest form of control is the one that never needs to assert itself visibly. The cost of absolute structure. While this system excels at maintaining order, it raises important questions about adaptability and human impact. When every aspect of life is regulated, there is little room for personal agency. Decisions are made externally. Choices are limited. Autonomy is minimal. For the institution, this is a feature. For individuals, it can be disorienting. Over time, reliance on structure can erode decision-making confidence. When the system decides everything, the ability to navigate uncertainty weakens. This is not immediately visible within the walls. It becomes apparent later, during transitions, step-down programs, or release. A machine that rarely pauses. Supermax prisons are designed to operate continuously. Procedures do not change based on mood or circumstance. The system does not pause to reflect, it executes. This consistency is what makes it effective. It is also what makes it difficult to soften. Security, surveillance, and control form a closed loop. Each element reinforces the others. Once established, the system sustains itself. And while it succeeds in preventing certain risks, it also creates conditions that profoundly shape the people who live within it. To understand those effects, we must look next at what prolonged exposure to this level of control does to the human mind, and how people cope with an environment that allows almost no room for spontaneity or connection. The psychological toll of total isolation. The most profound effects of a Supermax prison are not always visible. They do not announce themselves through physical injury or dramatic incidents. Instead, they unfold quietly, over time, inside the mind. In a place built on isolation and control, the psychological impact is not a side effect of the system. It is an unavoidable consequence of how the system works. Inside facilities like ADX Florence, people are not simply confined. They are separated from nearly every form of normal human feedback. Conversation becomes rare. Touch disappears entirely. Spontaneity is replaced by routine. Over months and years, this absence begins to reshape how a person thinks, feels, and relates to the world. When isolation becomes the environment, human beings are not built for prolonged solitude. Even brief periods of isolation can alter mood and perception. In a Supermax, isolation is not brief, and it is not optional. At first, many people experience heightened alertness. The mind scans constantly for stimulation, a sound in the hallway, a change in routine, anything that breaks the monotony. Small events feel disproportionately important. A delayed meal, a different guard's voice, a new television program. Over time, this heightened state gives way to something else. The nervous system begins to recalibrate. Without regular social interaction, emotional responses can flatten. Reactions slow. Feelings that once came naturally, excitement, anticipation, curiosity, become muted. This is not apathy. It is adaptation. Distorted time and space. One of the most commonly reported psychological effects of long-term isolation is time distortion. Without external markers, conversations, social obligations, varied environments, time loses its structure. Days can feel endlessly long, yet months pass with little memory of what distinguished one from another. People may struggle to recall specific events from recent weeks while remembering details from years earlier with clarity. The mind prioritizes what is emotionally charged, and in isolation, there is very little emotional variation. Space is affected in similar ways. In a concrete cell with limited visual depth, spatial awareness narrows. Some individuals describe a subtle sense of disorientation, not dizziness, but a reduced ability to feel anchored in place. Direction loses meaning. Location becomes abstract. The world shrinks, and the mind shrinks with it. The inner dialogue grows louder. In the absence of conversation, internal dialogue intensifies. Thoughts that would normally be interrupted by daily interaction loop repeatedly. Memories replay. Regrets resurface. Hypothetical futures are rehearsed again and again. For some, this leads to increased self-reflection. For others, it fuels anxiety or despair. Without external reality checks, worries can grow unchecked. Minor concerns feel monumental. Uncertainty becomes overwhelming. The mind fills the silence whether it is wanted or not. This is why structure becomes so important. Without it, the internal world can become consuming. Coping through routine. Survival in a supermax often depends on creating personal systems within an institutional one. People establish strict routines not because they are required to, but because routine creates boundaries inside an otherwise endless day. Exercise at specific times. Reading goals. Writing schedules. Television limited to certain hours. These routines serve a psychological function. They divide time into manageable pieces. They create progress where none is externally visible. They provide evidence that the individual still has agency, however limited. Even small choices, when to shower, how to arrange personal items, what to focus on mentally, become acts of self-preservation. Emotional suppression and control. In an environment where emotional expression has no outlet, emotions often turn inward. Anger cannot be released through conversation or physical activity with others. Sadness has no audience. Joy has nowhere to go. As a result, many people learn to suppress emotional responses altogether. This suppression is adaptive inside the prison. It reduces vulnerability. It prevents emotional exhaustion. But suppression comes at a cost. Over time, the ability to access emotions voluntarily can diminish. People report feeling detached, numb, or disconnected, not just from others, but from themselves. This emotional flattening may help someone endure isolation. It can make re-entry into social life deeply challenging. Mental health support under constraint. Supermax prisons do provide mental health services, but those services operate within strict limits. Sessions are brief. Interaction is controlled. Treatment options are constrained by security priorities. Mental health professionals working in these environments often face an impossible balance, addressing psychological distress without undermining institutional control. For individuals experiencing acute distress, support may be available. For those experiencing the slow erosion of well-being that isolation produces, help can feel distant or insufficient. The system is designed to prevent crisis. It is not designed to restore emotional health. The role of hope. Hope functions differently in a supermax. For people with a defined release date, hope becomes a countdown. Each day survived is one step closer to freedom. The future exists, even if it feels distant. For those without that certainty, hope becomes abstract. It attaches to small possibilities, a unit change, a privilege restored, a letter arriving on time. When hope disappears entirely, the psychological impact can be severe. Motivation collapses. Routine breaks down. The future stops existing in any meaningful way. Maintaining hope, even in minimal form, is often the difference between endurance and collapse. Carrying isolation beyond the walls. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of supermax confinement is how long its effects last. Isolation does not end when the door opens. The mind does not immediately recalibrate to social environments. Crowds feel overwhelming. Physical closeness can trigger discomfort. Unstructured social interaction feels chaotic rather than liberating. Habits formed in confinement persist. Hypervigilance. Emotional restraint. A need for control and predictability. These are not failures to adapt. They are signs that the mind did exactly what it needed to do to survive. Undoing that adaptation takes time, support, and patience. A system that measures stability, not healing. From an institutional perspective, psychological stability is defined narrowly: compliance, calm behavior, and absence of incidents. By that measure, Supermax prisons often appear successful. But stability is not the same as well-being. A person can appear stable while experiencing profound internal distress. They can follow every rule while slowly disconnecting from their own emotional life. This distinction is critical because when individuals eventually leave these environments, whether through step-down programs or release, they return to a world that demands emotional engagement, adaptability, and social connection. Skills that isolation does not nurture. The human cost of control. The psychological toll of a Supermax prison cannot be reduced to statistics alone. It is lived quietly, day after day, in small internal adjustments that accumulate over time. Isolation reshapes how people experience time, emotion, and identity. It does so predictably because the system itself is predictable. Understanding this toll does not require condemning or defending the system outright. It requires acknowledging that absolute control has consequences, and those consequences extend far beyond the prison walls. To complete the picture, we must look at what happens when people finally leave this environment, how they re-enter society, what they carry with them, and what their experiences reveal about punishment, safety, and rehabilitation. Release, reintegration, and the long shadow of a Supermax. Leaving a Supermax prison is not a single moment. It is a process that begins long before the door opens and continues long after the outside world comes back into view. For people who have lived under conditions of near total isolation, release is less like freedom arriving all at once and more like gravity slowly changing direction. In places such as ADX Florence, the system is designed primarily to hold people in. Letting them out, whether to another facility or to society itself, has never been its central purpose. As a result, the transition out can be disorienting, uneven, and emotionally complex. The step-down concept. Most Supermax systems recognize that moving directly from extreme isolation to full social environments is risky. To address this, they employ step-down units, structured phases that gradually reintroduce limited interaction, increased movement, and small degrees of autonomy. On paper, these programs are meant to serve two goals: test sustained compliance and stability. Prepare individuals for environments with more social complexity. The changes are incremental. More time outside the cell, limited group recreation, supervised communication with a small number of peers, slightly relaxed routines. But even these modest changes can feel overwhelming. After years of silence and strict structure, noise returns abruptly. Conversation requires attention. Body language becomes relevant again. Social rules, long dormant, must be relearned. For some, this transition is energizing. For others, it is deeply unsettling. Relearning human proximity. One of the most difficult adjustments after Supermax confinement is physical proximity to other people. In isolation, personal space becomes absolute. No one enters it. No one touches you. Even brief, accidental closeness disappears from daily life. When that barrier is suddenly removed, the nervous system often reacts before the mind does. Crowded rooms feel threatening. Unexpected movement triggers alertness. Loud environments exhaust rather than excite. These reactions are not irrational. They are learned responses to years of enforced distance. Relearning comfort around others takes time. It cannot be rushed, and it does not follow a predictable timeline. Freedom without familiarity. Another challenge of release is the loss of structure. Inside a Supermax, every hour is defined. Meals arrive at set times. Movement is scheduled. Expectations are explicit. There is little ambiguity. Outside, ambiguity is everywhere. Choices return all at once. Where to go? What to do? How to respond? Decisions that once would have felt trivial can become overwhelming. Some people describe this as standing in front of too many open doors after years of staring at a single wall. The skills required to navigate freedom, flexibility, spontaneity, social intuition are the very skills isolation suppresses. Identity after confinement. Prolonged isolation reshapes identity in subtle ways. Inside, survival often depends on emotional restraint, routine, and inward focus. Expressing vulnerability offers no advantage. Adapting to others is unnecessary when others are absent. Outside, those traits can feel mismatched. People may struggle to reconnect with earlier versions of themselves. Interests have changed. Relationships have evolved. The world has moved on. Technology, culture, and social norms may feel unfamiliar. Simple tasks, using new devices, navigating crowded spaces, managing rapid communication, can provoke frustration or self-doubt. This is not because individuals are incapable. It is because the environment they adapted to no longer exists. Family and relationships. Reconnecting with loved ones is often the most anticipated and most complicated part of release. Families have endured long periods of limited contact. Roles have shifted. Children have grown. Partners have learned to cope independently. When reunion happens, expectations can collide with reality. The person returning may still carry habits formed in confinement, hypervigilance, need for control, emotional reserve. Loved ones may expect immediate closeness and openness. Both sides are adjusting. Successful reintegration often depends on patience, on recognizing that reconnection is a process, not an event. Mental health beyond the walls. The psychological effects of Supermax confinement do not end at release. Symptoms such as anxiety, emotional numbness, sleep disruption, and difficulty concentrating can persist. Some individuals benefit from structured support, therapy, and gradual exposure to social environments. Others face these challenges with limited resources. The irony is that once someone is released, institutional support often decreases dramatically. The system that controlled every detail of life withdraws, leaving individuals to navigate recovery largely on their own. This gap between confinement and reintegration is one of the most significant challenges facing people who leave Supermax prisons. Measuring success. From an institutional standpoint, success is often measured by compliance and recidivism rates. Did the individual follow rules? Did they avoid reoffending? But these metrics tell only part of the story. They do not capture the internal effort required to re-engage with the world. They do not measure emotional health, sense of belonging, or quality of life. A person can meet every formal requirement while still struggling quietly. True reintegration is not just about staying out of trouble. It is about rebuilding a life that feels meaningful and sustainable. The shadow that remains. Even years after release, many people describe the experience of Supermax confinement as something that stays with them. Not always as trauma in the dramatic sense, but as a lens through which the world is viewed. Silence may still feel comforting. Structure may still feel safer than uncertainty. Solitude may remain preferable to crowds. These preferences are not failures to move on. They are traces of adaptation. The challenge lies in integrating those adaptations into a world that operates differently, finding balance between the self that survived confinement and the self that must now live freely. What Supermax prisons reveal. Looking at release and reintegration forces a broader question into focus. What is the ultimate purpose of a Supermax prison? If the goal is containment, these facilities succeed. If the goal is safety within the walls, they are effective. But if the goal includes preparing people to return to society, the picture becomes more complicated. Supermax prisons are built to manage risk, not to cultivate connection. They prioritize control over rehabilitation. That choice carries consequences that extend beyond incarceration. Understanding those consequences does not require rejecting the system outright. It requires acknowledging its limits. Beyond the walls. When someone leaves a Supermax prison, they carry more than a release date. They carry habits, perceptions, and psychological adjustments shaped by years of extreme control. Society often sees release as an ending. For those who lived inside, it is the beginning of a different kind of challenge. Freedom, after isolation, is not instant relief. It is a skill to be relearned. And how well that relearning goes depends not only on the individual, but on the support, patience, and understanding waiting on the outside. What Supermax prisons leave behind. When people talk about Supermax prisons, the conversation often ends at security. Strong walls, unbreakable routines, absolute control. From the outside, that sounds like success. Facilities like ADX Florence are designed to eliminate chaos, reduce violence, and prevent influence from spreading beyond the walls. And by those standards, they work. Escapes are nearly impossible. Incidents are rare. The system runs quietly, predictably, and efficiently. But silence can hide as much as it reveals. Behind those concrete walls, people learn how to survive in an environment where isolation is constant and control is total. They adapt in ways that are necessary inside, but complicated outside. They learn to live without touch, without conversation, without choice. They learn discipline, restraint, and emotional control not as virtues, but as survival tools. And those tools don't simply disappear when the door opens. Supermax prisons show us what happens when safety becomes the only metric that matters. When containment replaces connection. When risk management outweighs rehabilitation. They force us to confront a difficult truth. A system can function exactly as designed and still leave lasting human consequences. This is not about excusing crime. It is not about ignoring victims. It is not about pretending these prisons exist without reason. It is about understanding the full cost of extreme control. Because punishment does not end at the sentence. It echoes in how people think, how they relate to others, and how they rebuild their lives, if they are ever given the chance to rebuild at all. When we look at Supermax prisons honestly, we are really asking a larger question about ourselves. What do we want justice to accomplish? Security alone? Or something that also allows for return, repair, and reintegration? The answers are not simple, but they matter because the systems we build reflect the values we choose to prioritize. And in the end, how we treat the most isolated people in our society says more about us than it does about them. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.